Oh, the magpie brings us tidings of news both fair and foul. She's more cunning than the raven, more wise than any owl.
Hello lovelies, today we're having a quick looky-loo at the Savage World of Solomon Kane. Now I believe there is a later edition. This was the first one that came out, and as implied by the name, it's the Savage World's version of Solomon Kane as a game. Solomon Kane, of course, being one of Robert E. Howard's less known, less appreciated characters compared to Conan, certainly, which everybody knows. Solomon Kane, nonetheless, had quite a bit written about him, kind of scattershot throughout his life, not necessarily written in chronological order. And I find him to be a compelling character, and I even liked the film that came out, which was perhaps a little bit overblown. Was it Purefoy was in that, I think? Anyway, I quite liked that. Now, I like Solomon Kane enough that it overcame my reservations about Savage Worlds, which I still have today. I loved it as the basis for Deadlands, but every time I've tried to use Savage Worlds for anything else, it hasn't quite felt right, and it doesn't quite work as a fully generic game. I'm curious to see how it will work out with Rifts, because anything is an improvement on Palladium. But yeah, Savage Worlds is what powers this, and Savage Worlds is somewhat sold as a pulp adventure suitable system, probably due to its entanglement with westerns and other materials since. Pulp's a weird one. It's a bit of an old sore in the role-playing community now, but game designers tend to be quite into their pulp, into their pulp fiction, the older versions of science fiction and adventure serials and so on. A lot more, unfortunately, than players are. A lot of the time, players don't seem to be quite so into the pulps, which means there have been a lot of efforts by well-meaning game designers who love the pulps to bring them to the table, and it never tends to turn out quite as well as they would like in terms of sales or whatever else. Why this should be a thing, I don't know. Maybe game designers and games masters tend to be more into older fiction, into reading, perhaps. I don't know. Willing to do the extra, and maybe we prefer it because pulp heroes tend to be more tightly focused and less powerful. Maybe that's what it is, and so we prefer that for something to run. I don't know, but there's never been any really huge breakout success that tackles the pulp genre. Maybe Fate's Spirit of the Century, but it's Fate as a sort of general system that really took off, rather than necessarily through that. But yeah, that is the received wisdom. Solomon Kane is very definitely a pulp character. He has the characteristics of typical pulp characters. You know, strong, moralistic, self-reliant, all of those sorts of things that you typically find. Powerful, but not super heroic, but with access to abilities beyond those of normal mortal men to an extent, generally by proxy. Also, pulp heroes tend to have a bit of an entourage of secondary characters that turn up now and again, and that's certainly the case for Kane. Kane is a Puritan, a Christian warrior, but in the early modern period, so same general area as Lamentations of the Flame Princess, but a lot less weird while still being weird, and a lot more survivable, I guess. So in the stories, he travels around the world, getting into various scrapes from the shores of England, right the way down through Africa, into Asia occasionally. And usually wherever he goes, there is weirdness and magic and unholy goings on and so on, which he is able to put paid to with the sword, the pistol, his faith, a magic stick, or a combination thereof. Now, it is Savage Worlds, but it has the rules in here as well, albeit a slightly abridged version compared to the separate rules. So it was an all-in-one book, so it has that going for it to an extent. And it covers all its ground fairly well, I suppose. It also goes into and through a lot of the stories of Solomon Kane and everything that he got up to, the people and monsters that he encountered. It is a very complete book. And yet, I thought I'd reviewed this before. Maybe I did in text somewhere, but regardless, reading through it again to do this retrospective, I found myself feeling a little bit depressed by it, which isn't a great selling point now, is it? But that needs explanation, and I'm not entirely sure how to attack the explanation of why I found it depressing. Part of it's just that I've had trouble finding Savage Worlds to fit anything, and I don't know whether it fits Solomon Kane or not. On reading, I'd have to say kinda, but doesn't do quite what I would want it to do for a somewhat grittier, almost horror-based game. Part of it's that. I think most of it is in the presentation, right? And you're probably looking at this as I flip through it and thinking, well, that looks alright, fairly modern, sort of standard. Art's a bit mixed, but some of it's really good. The page borders and everything are artistic while not being rendered unreadable. So that might strike you as a bit odd, but okay, do you remember White Wolf books? Those would often be annoying for a few reasons, but amongst those reasons was the problem that the information was often hidden in pages and pages of interminable, relatively low quality fiction, or stuff written from the viewpoint of an unreliable narrator. And often that useful information was not ever extracted from the text and put into a referenceable form. And so if you had to look something up in a White Wolf book while working on a plot, or we probably experienced this more running LARPs because you had to try and follow canon to an extent, but it was rendered incredibly difficult. Or you can look at something like Morkborg or any of the other kind of follow along art punk art book games, and the experience of reading them is often quite pleasing and pleasant, and draws you into the atmosphere and the lore and everything else of the game. But again, trying to look anything up is rendered difficult because the game rule stuff is kind of obfuscated in all of the presentation and the weirdly written text, or hidden in passages of lore, or implied by the artwork, and so you have to do a lot of exegesis to try and understand what you're being told and what the actual information on the page is. Now, Solomon Kane here has a similar problem, but presented in a different way. This is a really long-winded explanation, for which I apologise. When you're writing tabletop role-playing games, you have to switch between like 3 different modes almost. There's the rules parts that you present. There are sort of fictive elements that you might present. Now I've lost my train of thought. Rules, fictive elements, lore, right? So those are the 3 main modes that you present things in, and each one of them has a subtly different style, right? And you have to mode switch between them as you go through different sections of the book. There's a little bit of crossover, but generally speaking, the rule stuff will be in the rules section. You will use fictive elements to break things up, and then you will present the lore in its own way, almost like a travelogue. So to write a role-playing game book, you need to be somewhat good at each of those 3 elements. And then I guess there's kind of a 4th one, which is adventure writing. But similarly, that breaks down between those 3 different things. And as a reader as well, you have to mode switch between the different things that you're doing. You know, whether you're reading the rules and trying to comprehend them, whether you're taking in the fiction and maybe enjoying it as fiction, or whether you're taking in the lore and trying to think and draw inspiration from it. The trouble with this book is that it constantly switches back and forth as you go through the text between these things. So when it is talking about a place, it kind of switches back and forth between the kind of travelogue and lore information about the place, and then game information, and then it's just kind of flick-flacking back and forth, which makes the whole book, apart from the initial sort of introduction and rules segment, it makes the entire rest of the book a chaotic mishmash of these other elements, which you're constantly having to flip back and forth between. That makes looking things up difficult, and it makes the sitting down and reading of the book difficult, because you're getting a kind of cognitive whiplash constantly from mode switching as you're reading it. And so that greatly diminishes the usefulness of the book and the enjoyment of trying to read it. So as a role-playing game, it is hard to reference. As a reading experience, it is disjointed and chaotic. And as a lore book for Solomon Kane, you know, it has everything in here, but it's not as easily comprehended or referenced as, say, an encyclopedia would be. You know, when I was approaching the Gore books by John Norman, I had my main book, which had basic information on everything, sufficient to play the game if you wanted, and then I separated out all the lore into an encyclopedia, which was arranged alphabetically. I did that for a couple of reasons. 1, ease of reference, and 2, because it meant I could sell the encyclopedia to people who weren't interested in role-playing games. So, you know, there's that. But there have been a lot of RPGs that have also acted as useful encyclopedias of intellectual properties, and so people have bought them because of that reason. But this, while it contains all the information, remains hard to reference, hard to use, and so on. Also, this might be controversial, but I think it is perhaps too concentrated, too fixated upon Solomon Kane himself and his particular adventures themselves. Now, of course, you need some of that. Otherwise, it's not a Solomon Kane RPG. But it also feels like you, as a set of players, adventurers, you as a games master, are hemmed in by the exploits and stories of Solomon Kane himself. and I don't think it did enough to open itself up. Now, as I say, I think there's been a later version. I have no idea whether it managed to address any of these problems that I've mentioned. If anyone owns one of the newer editions, let me know down in the comments, please. But yeah, I was left kind of depressed again, and I remember that was my reaction in the first place, and maybe that's why I didn't review it on video before now, because I just felt frustrated and annoyed, and yeah, at the same time that I got this at a convention. Must have been one of the Gen Cons, or maybe the last Gen Con I went to, which was in the circus tent. That's Euro Gen Con. Or perhaps it would have been a Dragon Meet. Long time ago now, anyway. But the people were so enthusiastic and nice and clearly very into Solomon Kane that I felt bad about reviewing it when I didn't like it that much. But enough time has passed, I suppose, that has now changed. But still, like I say, I don't know how the newer version is. Again, someone tell me if they can. It's just to run this, which I wanted to do when I picked it up. I was all enthusiastic. It's going to be difficult because the book is going to be working against you to a large extent as you're trying to reference things and look things up. And I'm still not 100% convinced that Savage Worlds is the best fit for it. Solomon Kane, especially since seeing the movie as well, has felt a lot more, and rereading the stories not so long ago, has always felt a bit more gritty and grimy and violent than I think Savage Worlds necessarily allows for. Of course, your mileage may vary, you're free to disagree with me, that's fine. I really would be interested if anyone has picked up the newer version, if they can tell me anything about the newer version. Zang.
Bitch, where's my money? If you want to help me out, you can subscribe to me on Patreon, which is Grimachu, on Subscribestar, which is Grim-Jim, or if you want to make a one-off donation to help support me and keep the channel going, you can do so at paypal.me, jdesborough.
The priest he says we're wicked, but to worship the devil's bird. But we respect the old ways and we disregard his word. For we know they rest uneasy as we slumber in the night, and we'll always leave out a little bit of meat for the bird that's black and white. One's for sorrow, two's for joy.